everyone, I'm Brittany and today I'm going to go over the basics on how to shoot in manual mode on a DSLR camera. Sometimes it can be kind of scary to move your camera off of auto mode into that dreaded manual mode. There are a few concepts that you need to understand in order to do it, and today we'll go over those. I'm going to start off with what you'll need to start. Obviously a DSLR camera to practice on, an outdoor location, and then some sort of object to practice shooting with. Okay, we're going to begin by setting our camera to manual mode. On your camera, it'll be a little M on top. Both Nikon and Canon have an M. So after you switch to manual mode, the next thing you're going to want to do is change your white balance and your ISO both to auto. Then we're going to move into aperture. There's three aspects you need to understand in order to shoot in manual mode, and those are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. We set the ISO to auto already, so the camera's going to do that for us, and we'll focus on that later. Right now we're going to focus on the aperture. Aperture is what controls the depth of field in a photograph. So shallow depth of field means that an image is really focused here and the background's blurry. And then a deeper depth of field will have this in focus as well as the entire background. And then you'll see the numbers on your camera. A lower number in aperture means that it's more shallow depth of field. A higher number relates to a deeper depth of field. We are going to start by setting ours to 2.0. That's a generally low aperture. If you don't have that on your camera, then try to shoot for the lowest your camera will allow, probably around a 3.5. Then we're going to take a photo at that aperture and see what the photo looks like. You'll notice with that photo that this object that you're shooting is in focus while the background's blurred out. That's my style, so that's probably what I'll stick with, but other people have different styles and what they want in focus. So next we'll go to a higher f-stop so that you can see what it looks like. We're going to go to f11 and see if you guys like that one. When you look at that photo, you'll notice how the background is generally pretty clear. Now, like I said, my style is more that I choose to have a more shallow depth of field, so I'm going to stick with the 2.0. Now that we've decided how we want our photo to look, we're going to focus on the exposure of the photo. The first thing we want to do is change our ISO from auto to 100. The reason we're going to do this is because we no longer want the auto to control the ISO. We want to control it ourselves. Changing it to 100 will not allow a lot of light into your camera, but within an outdoor situation like this, you don't need an extreme amount of light coming in. The reason you would change your ISO to a higher number would be in low lighting situations like indoors or at night, things like that. After you change it to 100, we're going to focus on the shutter speed. Shutter speed is how fast your camera takes the photo. So a higher shutter speed, like 1/500th of a second, is going to take the photo very fast. This is very good for taking pictures like sports and moving vehicles, anything like that. But also with a fast shutter speed comes a downside of not a lot of light coming into your camera. Lower shutter speeds, like 1/60th of a second, are going to let a lot more light into your camera, but when shooting something like sports, the image would become a lot more blurry. 1/60th of a second usually would work nice for stable objects like this, or maybe even doing landscape or anything on a tripod. If you go any lower than 1/60th of a second when handheld, like I am here, it's going to come out slightly blurry the lower you go. So if I was shooting this for an entire second, it's going to be blurry because I'm going to be moving for that second. I can't stand completely still like a tripod could for a second. So when you're shooting handheld, you want to stay around 1/60th of a second. So we're going to use the shutter speed to control the light. Because we're shooting a stable object, it doesn't really matter if we don't really need a really fast shutter speed because it's not moving at all. And we don't need a really low one because it's not a low light situation. We're going to start by shooting at 1/60th of a second. That's about the lowest you want to go when you're shooting handheld, so we'll start there and see what it looks like. Alright, as you can see, that image is a little bright. For my style, I want to allow a little less light into the camera so it becomes a slightly darker image. I'm going to start by switching my shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. This will allow less light into our camera and hopefully allow for a proper exposure to my liking. To me, that image looks a lot better. As you can tell, all three of these aspects of the camera are closely connected to each other. They all affect light, but then they all affect something to their own standards. I'll do a quick review so you can easily understand them the next time you're shooting in manual mode. We'll go back to aperture. Aperture controls the depth of field, but also controls light. A lower aperture is going to create a shallower depth of field, but it's also going to let more light into the camera. While a higher aperture is going to allow for a wider, deeper depth of field, it's also going to let less light into the camera. Now going back to ISO. ISO also controls light, and that's its main job. A lower ISO, such as 100, is going to let less light into your camera, but it's also going to have a lot less noise. While a higher number, the highest my camera can go is 12,800, is going to allow a lot more light into your camera, but it's also going to create a lot of noise. And that's a little distracting to the picture, so that's why you only want to use it in low lighting situations, while you use the other aspects to control light other times. Back to shutter speed. Shutter speed also controls light. Seeing how all of these just mainly control light in different ways. Shutter speed also, though, controls the speed of the shutter and how fast an image will be taken. So remember, in sports, you want a higher, faster one, which would be example 1/500th of a second. While taking pictures at night on a tripod, you'll want a lower one, which would be maybe even half a second. All of these are very dependent on each other. And with that said, there's no perfect formula in any circumstance that I could just give you and you just know how to shoot in manual mode. It's important that you understand these and then you can use them when you're shooting out on your own. I hope you learned something. Thanks.